The morning Marcus Hale and his brother-in-law Derek Souza drove their truck up Forest Service Road 332 in Benewah County, Idaho. They had 3 days of elk tags, 60 pounds of gear, and a legal permit to access the Marble Creek drainage. It was September 14, 2019, 4:47 a.m. The trailhead gate was still padlocked when they arrived. Standard procedure. They parked, ran through their gear check, and started moving equipment to the trail shoulder. That's when the man was already there. He was standing at the wooden bulletin board near the trailhead register, not walking toward them, not approaching from a vehicle, already positioned. He was wearing a canvas jacket, work boots, and he had a laminated badge clipped to his chest that Marcus later described as a tribal resource identification card. His name was Raymond Clearwater. He did not introduce himself immediately. He looked at Marcus, then at the ridge visible above the tree canopy to the northeast. Then he said, "You're going up the Marble Creek side toward the grandmother ridgeline." It was not a question. Marcus confirmed it. Clearwater nodded once. "You need to come back down before 1400 hours. Do not stay past that." Marcus asked why. Clearwater looked at the ridgeline again, a full 4 seconds before he answered. "Because something up there has been watching the trail since August, and it does not leave at dark." He handed Marcus a handwritten note with a phone number on it. Then he walked to a gray pickup and drove east without another word. Marcus pocketed the note. They went up anyway. Marcus called the number that evening from camp. No signal. He tried again at the trailhead the following morning after they came down. Clearwater answered on the second ring. Over the next 4 days, Marcus conducted 3 recorded phone conversations with him, the last one lasting 47 minutes. What emerged was not the testimony of a folklore keeper or a tribal mystic.
It was the documented account of a man who had spent 4 decades working the intersection of indigenous land management and state wildlife jurisdiction. Raymond Clearwater, 74 years old at the time of the incident, had served as a wildlife liaison for the Coeur d'Alene tribe from 1981 to 2009. His role was technical, coordinating with Idaho Department of Fish and Game on migration corridors, documenting predator activity in sensitive zones, and flagging areas where tribal usage rights conflicted with state hunting allocations. He had filed over 200 field reports during that tenure. He knew the Marble Creek drainage specifically. He had surveyed it in 1988, again in 1994, and submitted a formal anomaly report to Fish and Game in 2003 after a tribal hunting party returned early from the same ridgeline Marcus had just accessed. That 2003 report existed in the system. It had been reclassified from wildlife behavioral anomaly to ungulate stress event by a supervising officer whose name Clearwater remembered precisely, District Officer Paul Renner, Coeur d'Alene Field Office. Renner retired in 2011. The report has not been amended. Clearwater was not speculating about the ridgeline. He had a paper trail 20 years deep. That detail changed how Marcus listened to everything that followed. They had entered the Marble Creek Trail at 0640 on September 14th. The first mile was standard North Idaho timber, second growth Douglas fir, occasional western larch, understory thick with huckleberry brush gone rust-colored for autumn. Derek had hunted this drainage twice before, in 2015 and 2017. He noted the first anomaly at approximately mile 1.4, no squirrel activity. In September, in that elevation band, roughly 3,400 feet, red squirrels are audible, almost crashing behavior, territorial calls. Derek had hunted enough of this terrain to use squirrel noise as ambient confirmation that nothing large was actively moving through the area. There was none.
He mentioned it to Marcus. They kept moving. At mile 1.9, the trail crosses a seasonal creek via a log bridge, 2 planks wide, stable enough for loaded pack animals. Marcus's dog, a 4-year-old Deutsch Drostar named Coda, had crossed that bridge without hesitation in 2018 when Marcus hunted a different section of the same drainage. On September 14th, Coda stopped 12 feet from the bridge, sat down, refused forward movement for 9 minutes. Marcus eventually carried him across. Above 1,800 feet, the bird activity dropped to 0. Not reduced, absent. No Clark's nutcrackers, no Steller's jays, no raven calls. Ravens are present in that drainage year-round. Marcus had never recorded their absence there in any prior season. He was recording with a handheld audio device, standard practice for hunters logging game sign. He noted the silence on the recording at 01:17. Played back later, that recording captured something else beneath the ambient wind. A low, intermittent contact sound,
below 200 Hz. Directional, coming from the northeast, from the ridgeline. They reached the 3.7-mile mark at 0934. That is where the game trail ended. Not tapered, not redirected by terrain. The defined elk trail they had been following, pressed earth, consistent width, active sign on both edges, simply stopped. The vegetation on either side was undisturbed. No branching, no crossing point. The trail terminated as if something had decided at this specific location that it would not continue. Marcus photographed it. What replaced the game trail was a flattened corridor running perpendicular to their direction of travel, 11 feet wide, pressed flat through standing brush and low timber in a straight line running approximately east-northeast. Not a game trail. The compression pattern was inconsistent with elk or bear movement. Too wide, too uniform, no hoof impressions, no claw drag.
40 feet further up the slope, a lodgepole pine, roughly 60 years old, with bark stripped cleanly from its trunk. The stripping began at 9 feet above ground level. The upper boundary was not reached. It continued beyond what Marcus could measure without equipment. Whatever removed that bark had worked downward from a height he could not determine. At the 4.1-mile mark, they found 3 elk carcasses within a 200-foot radius. Adult cow elk, all 3. No visible predator feeding, no organ rupture, no bone exposure. The animals appeared structurally intact, as if they had simply stopped functioning and fallen where they stood. No blood pooling, no scatter. Marcus's trail camera, a Browning Strike Force unit set at that location 11 days earlier, showed a trigger event at 02:18 on September 9th. The image file was completely black. The camera's motion sensor was functioning. The infrared emitter had fired. Nothing had reflected it back. When Marcus described the flattened corridor and the elk carcasses to Clearwater during their second recorded call, the elder went quiet for 11 seconds. Then he said one word: Nupika. Marcus asked him to spell it. Clearwater did. Then he explained, with the precision of a man who had been waiting to explain it for a long time, what the word meant within Shitsuomsh oral tradition. Not a spirit, not a demon, a category, a classification the tribe had maintained for observed entities that did not conform to known animal behavior, moved through territory without establishing pattern, and were documented across multiple generations in the same geographic zones. The Marble Creek Ridgeline had its own entry in that oral record. Clearwater cross-referenced it with specific language. The Nupika of the grandmother ridgeline had been described consistently across accounts, separated by decades, as something that followed without closing distance, watched without approach, and only escalated contact when certain behaviors were demonstrated by the observed party. Those behaviors had been codified into 3 prohibitions. First, no direct eye contact if the entity became visible, peripheral acknowledgement only. Direct eye contact had preceded every documented escalation in the tribal record. Second, no running. Movement should be continuous, deliberate, and directionally consistent. Erratic or rapid flight behavior appeared to trigger pursuit response. Third, no shelter taken beneath fallen timber. Deadfall and root systems were specifically named in the oral record as locations where contact had occurred at closest range. Clearwater had not invented these rules. They appeared in a handwritten tribal council document dated 1961, itself described as a transcription of oral instruction passed down from the early reservation period. There was one additional data point. Idaho Fish and Game's 1987 internal memo, later obtained by a tribal attorney, flagged the same ridgeline for what the supervising warden described as repeated reports of coordinated ungulate mortality with no identifiable predator signature. The memo recommended no further investigation. They had turned back at the 4.1-mile mark by 10:20 hours. Marcus made that decision based on one calculation. Clearwater had said 1,400. They had roughly 4 miles of trail between them and the trailhead. At a loaded hiking pace, that was 3 hours minimum. The math gave in the reasonable exit window if they moved without stopping. They moved without stopping. For the first 40 minutes, the descent was uneventful. Coda walked ahead, which Marcus took as a positive indicator. The dog had been reluctant at the creek crossing on the way up. On the return, he was moving forward without hesitation, ears forward, not pinned. That changed at 11:03. At approximately mile 2.6 from the trailhead, Marcus registered movement in the dense Engelmann spruce running parallel to the trail on the eastern slope. 40 feet of lateral separation. He stopped, held up a fist. Derek stopped behind him. The movement was not wind-driven. It was directional, tracking north to south, matching their line of travel. The spacing between displacement events in the canopy was consistent, rhythmic. Whatever was generating it was moving at roughly their walking pace. 40 feet east, staying 40 feet east. Marcus checked his GPS unit, a Garmin InReach he had used without issue for 3 seasons. The device showed no satellite connection. He had full signal at the 4.1-mile mark 90 minutes earlier. He lost signal for 11 minutes exactly. At 11:19, Derek raised his rifle scope to glass the spruce line. He reported the interior of the scope to fogged, not the exterior lens, the internal optics. Ambient temperature at that elevation was 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Conditions did not support internal condensation. The paralleling movement continued for another 22 minutes. Neither man spoke during that time. Neither man ran. They had remembered that much from Clearwater. What they had not anticipated was how difficult it would be to keep walking at a normal pace when something was matching every step. At 11:42 hours, the paralleling movement stopped. Marcus noted the exact time because he checked his watch when the spruce line went still, not because he felt relief, because the sudden absence of sound after 22 minutes of consistent displacement was, in his words, more alarming than the movement itself. They kept walking. 40 seconds later, Marcus looked up from the trail. It was standing in a gap between 2 mature fir trees, 22 feet from the trail's eastern edge. He had not heard it cross the 40 feet of lateral separation. There was no sound associated with its appearance. It was simply there when it had not been there before. He stopped walking. Derek walked into his back. Marcus did not turn to signal Derek. He kept his eyes at the peripheral edge of his vision, not directly on the figure, not fully averted. He would later describe the discipline that required is the most difficult physical act of the entire encounter. What he registered in peripheral vision: bipedal, stationary, estimated height between 9 and 10 feet based on its position relative to the fir trees flanking it, both of which Marcus knew from passing to be approximately 60-foot specimens. The upper portion of its mass was above the first significant branch layer of the left tree. That branch sat at 9 feet. Its coloration was not uniform, darker in the torso region, the peripheral edges less defined, not clearly bounded against the tree line behind it. It did not move. Marcus could see its position clearly enough to confirm it was oriented toward them, facing them. It produced no sound. At 54 degrees Fahrenheit in still air, a large, warm-blooded animal at 22 feet would produce visible breath vapor. Marcus looked for it. There was none. They stood in that configuration for 2 minutes and 7 seconds. Marcus counted. He needed something to do with his mind that was not processing what he was looking at. At the 2-minute mark, Coda sat down on the trail behind Derek. Did not vocalize. Sat. Then the figure stepped backward. 1 step. 2. The tree line absorbed it without sound, without branch movement, without displacement of any visible understory. It was gone in 4 seconds. Marcus exhaled for the first time in over 2 minutes. He did not speak. Derek did not speak. They started walking. Same pace. Same direction.
Clearwater had told Marcus what the Shitsuamsh called it in their second conversation, the full designation, not the classification. Nupika Shilam. The watching thing. Not because of what it did, because of what it never stopped doing. They did not run. That decision was made without discussion. Neither man verbalized it. They had both heard Clearwater's second prohibition clearly enough that it functioned as a reflex suppressor, overriding the biological instruction that had been active in both of them since 1142. Marcus set the pace. Deliberate. Consistent. He estimated 2.8 miles per hour. Slower than a jog. Faster than a casual walk. Sustainable. Directionally clean. No weaving, no lateral movement, no stops. Coda walked directly between them. At mile 1.9, the creek crossing, Marcus registered the paralleling movement resume in the spruce line to the east. It had restarted at some point in the previous quarter mile without either of them identifying the exact moment of re-engagement. It was simply present again when they became aware of it. Same lateral distance, 40 feet. Same pace matching. Marcus did not look toward it. Derek kept his eyes on the trail directly in front of his boots. They had not discussed this either. Both men arrived at the same behavioral response independently and maintained it without coordination. The log bridge appeared ahead. Coda crossed it without hesitation. No pause, no resistance. He had refused it for 9 minutes on the approach 6 hours earlier, and now walked across it at a steady trot, as if the structure presented no information worth processing.
Marcus filed that as significant. He noted the time, 12:24. They crossed the bridge. The paralleling movement continued for exactly 1.4 miles past the creek crossing, measured afterward against Marcus's GPS track log, which had restored satellite connection at the bridge. The movement stopped at the 0.8-mile mark from the trailhead. No sound marked its cessation.
It was simply no longer occurring. The final 0.8 miles were silent in the way the forest had been silent before 0817 that morning. Complete, structureless, without ambient bird activity or squirrel sign. At 13:11, they reached the trailhead. Marcus's truck was the only vehicle in the lot. Clearwater's gray pickup was gone. Marcus sat in the driver's seat for 4 minutes before he started the engine. Derek did not ask him why. They both already knew they had followed the rules exactly. They did not yet know if that was the reason they were sitting in the truck. Marcus filed a report with Idaho Department of Fish and Game on September 17, 2019, 3 days after the encounter. He described the elk carcasses at the 4.1-mile mark, the flattened corridor, the stripped lodgepole pine, and the parallel movement alongside the trail. He included GPS coordinates for each location. He submitted the trail camera data, the triggered black frame from September 9th, as an attachment. He did not include a description of what he had seen at 11:42. The responding officer's written notation, returned to Marcus 12 days later, read, "Large ungulate disturbance consistent with late-season rut activity. No follow-up action indicated." No investigator was dispatched to the 4.1-mile mark. The out carcasses were not examined. Marcus's camera card, a 32-gigabyte SanDisk unit he had retrieved from the Browning unit and secured in a sealed plastic case in his truck's glove box, was blank when he accessed it upon returning home. Not corrupted, not partially recoverable. Blank, freshly formatted to factory state. He had not formatted it. Clearwater's statement to the Coeur d'Alene Tribal Council, delivered October 3, 2019, ran to 6 sentences. Marcus obtained a partial transcript through a tribal member contact. None of those 6 sentences appeared in any filed document. None of them have been made public. Raymond Clearwater declined all subsequent interview requests.
His tribal liaison record remained accessible through the Coeur d'Alene Administrative Office until February 2020, at which point it was reclassified as internal documentation. The 2003 anomaly report he had referenced, the one filed under District Officer Paul Renner, was marked inactive in the Idaho Fish and Game Digital Archive sometime between September and December 2019. The reclassification date was not logged. The Shitsuam seasonal closure on the Grandmother Ridgeline predates the Federal Wilderness Act of 1973 by at least 2 generations. Tribal elders contacted for this account confirmed the closure exists. None would specify its origin on record. Marcus returned to the Marble Creek trailhead in November 2019, not to hunt, to retrieve a ground blind he had left cached at the 1.2-mile mark on September 14th, below the creek crossing, well outside the area of the encounter. The blind was gone from its cached location. He found it 340 feet further up the trail, facing the ridgeline. Neither Marcus nor Derek had moved it. No one else had been issued a permit for that trailhead in November.